Welcome back to St. Croix Customer Appreciation Day with our live virtual seminars. The sun is shining, tons of people outside. It's a pretty cool environment here. And right now we have Jeremy Smith, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about musky fishing, river musky fishing. You've got a lot of knowledge in that space and a lot of cool tips and tactics to share with us.
Yeah. So we're in a great spot for river musky fishing. There's lots of rivers around here, and there's lots of muskies around here.
A lot of water. Of water. Muskies are a pretty cool fish, and a very popular fish around Park Falls here.
Yeah, no doubt.
We're excited for it. Thank you, Jeremy.
Cool, you bet. Sounds good. So thank you, and welcome everybody for showing up here. Yeah, the topic's going to be river musky fishing, which is one of my favorite things to do. I love catching anything that swims. However, muskies have a special spot, and rivers are often overlooked opportunities. And in many places throughout the upper Midwest, there are rivers that have awesome musky fishing that very few people access. And this also provides great shore fishing opportunities. You don't need a big boat for doing a lot of this stuff, a John boat, just a little aluminum V boat, kayaks. So there's really a lot of opportunities. But there are some things when it comes to fishing river muskies that are important. Once you kind of understand a river and how it works, muskies can be in very, very predictable locations throughout the year. So we're going to kind of run through that. So one of the concepts with river fishing is an idea called the run, the riffle, and the hole. So a run would be like a section of river that's a lot straighter. It's kind of a moderate depth, moderate flow. The riffles is what everybody's familiar with, like rapids or areas that have really swift water that's very shallow. And then, of course, the holes are often slacker water, very deep water areas in the river. And muskies will use all of those habitats throughout the course of the season. So once you understand how that river flows and the time of year, it can be really predictable on where you catch those muskies. And one thing that is great about river fishing as well is you don't necessarily need to have the greatest electronics or have all this technology, because your eyes can show you so much of what's happening there. You don't need to have side imaging and forward-facing sonar, though you can learn a lot from that. Just reading the water is really all it takes to become a really great river muskie angler. So let's go through a few of the things that really you need to keep in mind just to be a good angler in general, but a muskie angler. So you have to understand the nature of the fish. Muskies, outside of spawning, they're always looking to be around food, and muskies do really love cover as well. So laydowns, dead trees in the river, anytime you've got a big boulder pile that creates some slack water, weed beds. A lot of these rivers have wild celery, and they love hanging out in those areas. And if you drift over it, you often see red horse, white sucker. You might see a lot of different chub species in those areas. And of course, the muskies just get buried in there, and they love eating all of those soft prey forage items. So know that muskies like to be around cover, and often in river fishing situations, it's a lot of target casting, and that's really fun. So it makes musky fishing in many senses a lot more like bass fishing. So if you're fishing a big lake, you're often drifting big rock reefs, big shallow water flats with weeds, and you've got multiple anglers in the boat that are just making long bomb casts over vast areas. Well, with the river fishing, you often be coming around a corner, you see a point with some rocks sticking out of the water, maybe a little bit of weeds and a log or something. You're like, man, that looks like a beautiful spot, a current scene with all those cover elements. And you just make a nice accurate cast in there with your favorite lure. We'll talk about that. And you just see a fish come out and eat it. It's absolutely amazing. So it makes it really engaging because you're constantly moving in the river, but you're also trying to hit a lot of targets along the way. And that to me is what makes the river scene so incredible. And when you see areas that look good, they often have a muskie on it. So you get this great feedback where often fishing a lake, and it's hard to break down exactly where the fish might be. With rivers, it seems like when you see a spot that looks amazing, chances are almost always in your favor that there will be a fish near that spot if they're in any kind of a decent mood. So you get really a lot of positive feedback from muskies, which can be often the biggest challenge, is just to be able to see them and figure out where they are. So, but regardless, muskie fishing is it's rarely easy, right? I mean, there are those days when it can just be lights out, you can catch them, but even in the most unpressured waters, and that's what you see in a lot of river situations, is there's very little pressure. Muskies are still muskies. I've fished a lot of remote rivers in the North Country where I know I'm the only person that's fished that section of river this year. And if you have really poor weather conditions or poor water quality, whatever it may be, you can still have terrible fishing, right? I mean, it can happen, but also just know that when the conditions are right and the fish have never seen baits, it can be absolutely some of the most mind-blowing fishing that you'll ever experience. And one thing I'd recommend too for fishing these small rivers is if you've only got access to a canoe, that's great, but make sure you've got an anchor in the boat or some means. A trolling motor is also a great thing to have in these smaller rivers. The anchor can be a really, really big deal for river fishing just because you're moving so quickly. And then a lot of times you see a good spot, you might have missed it with your cast, you might have had a follow and the fish comes, it doesn't bite. But I've caught a lot of fish river fishing. This is just a kind of a side note. I'm sorry for digressing here, but a lot of times I've been fishing down a river. You might be fishing a section that looks good in an area, and boom, a big muskie blows up on a topwater, chases in a bucktail, but it doesn't bite. And you're like, wow, that fish is really hot. What I'll do a lot of times, and I've had tremendous success with this, is I'll throw an anchor in the water right away, and I stop there and don't cast. Sit down, have a break, have a sandwich, have a drink, whatever. Wait about 10 minutes, remember where that fish was, and make a cast back to exactly where you saw that fish, and they just bite. I've caught so many fish doing that. So being able to control your boat in the river is a really, really important deal. Just blindly drifting down the river, spinning around in circles can make the target casting more difficult because the fish are often on such specific spots. So I'm going to go through a couple things on where to find them, and then we'll jump into some of the presentation. So in the spring, when the muskie season opens, the fish are often either up along the bank or they spend a lot of time in tributaries of the main river. So if you've got, the main river might be muddy, might be dirty, but you've got some feeders that are a little bit clearer. They've got more moderate flow. They're not ripping. That's often where you'll find a lot of the muskies living. And they're often in slack water areas. So if you've got a big island on the river, the backside of it's calm, it's a big weed bed. Those are places where muskies will spawn. And they're some of the first places that you'll see muskies throughout the year. Now, as we get into this time of year, the fish are done spawning and they start to show up in very predictable areas that they'll be throughout most of the summer. So they'll end up being on big weed flats, like I talked about earlier, rock spots. Anytime you've got some current break in the area, laydowns, but typically in the summer, you want to focus on current. I'm not talking about the fastest current that you see in there, but generally some pretty good flow. It's a real easy temptation to just think that muskies are probably going to be in all these slack water eddies, and that's where you should spend your time. But most of the time, the active fish are going to be in the fast to moderate flowing water, which can often be in the middle of the river channel in the summer. And you'll pick up on that. You'll see a lot of the red horse in particular, which is a common fish and looks like a sucker. Common fish in most of the rivers throughout the upper Midwest. They spend most of their time in current areas. They like being in current, so where the food is, the fish are. Now, as you progress into fall, the fish really tend to make their way into deeper water. Often it can be slack water, but typically this is a slow to moderate flow in some of the deeper sections of the river. It doesn't have to be the deepest spot in the river, but it has to be deeper than most of the water around it. So you might want to look at a section of river that's, say, 10 miles long, and you know that there might be 3 spots within that 10-mile stretch where, the average depth of the river might be 4 feet, 5 feet, and there's a spot that's got, 12, 14 feet of water. Those spots are often where you can find muskies in the fall. And one thing about fall muskie fishing, especially in the very cold water, it is a huge consolidation of fish. The fish are very vulnerable. You can have some amazing days, and those fish will use those wintering holes year after year after year. You can take the location factor out of muskie fishing late in the fall. Once you've found areas where they live, and once the water gets below, I would say, that like 50 degree mark, once it gets below that, it's like those fish are there and they're going to be there all the way until you can't fish them anymore because it's too cold. So let's talk about some of the presentations that come into play for muskie fishing throughout the summertime. So, I don't think anybody would disagree who muskie fishes that I think a muskie's favorite food has to be a spinner, right? An inline spinner, a bucktail. So bucktails account for more muskies in the warm water period, whether it's rivers, whether it's lakes. It's just the most efficient tool you've got in your tackle box. and they just love eating them. So a couple things with river musky fishing. So this time of year, if I'm lake fishing, a lot of times I'm fishing double-bladed bucktails like size 8s, sometimes 7s, and those can often be a little bit hard to start, where you cast it out and you got to pump it a couple times to get those blades pumping and moving. When you're river fishing, like I'd mentioned, target casting is so very important in these situations. So you want bucktails that start instantly. So I'm saying that smaller, like double 8s, are one of the hardest blades to start. Often 10s start pretty good, but you want to make sure that you've got a spinner that the second that thing hits the water, it is running. So I fished a number of these. These are those Revolution blades. These are really great tools for river fishing. No matter what happens, this blade is turning the second it hits the water, because so many of those bites happen. You see the target you want to cast at. Looks like a muskie should be sitting there. Toss the bait in, it hits the water, you engage the reel and pull it once, and whack, you got them. So it's really important to make sure that the baits you're fishing with in rivers are starting right away. So I like fishing this. This is a Kramer Brothers Revolution. This is a really good bait. And then another blade style that's often overlooked is, if I can get this out, is a French blade. How many people musky fish know what this is all about, huh? Gosh, I've got it in a tackle box and I can't even keep it organized. But a French blade is a really good starting blade, and so is in Indiana. Colorados move a lot of water, but they can be a little bit harder to start. I love fishing them. If I'm fishing bigger rivers with more expansive flats and it's not so much target fishing, I will fish Colorados. But the French blade, the Indiana blade, those, like a fluted Indiana, those tend to be some of the best starting baits. And that, musky fishing is always just the smallest things can make the biggest difference, because when you start multiplying how many casts you're making, how many, these numbers start to add up over time. So little things make a big difference in musky fishing, and that's a big deal. And one other thing you'll say, I've got a lot of bright colors here, and fishing river muskies, I've had a lot of really good luck with bright colors, and I think there's a couple reasons for it. One, it's easier for the fish to see, but I've kind of looked at color in musky fishing in this way, is it seems like the more pressure the fish have, the more subdued you want your presentation to be. So olives, blacks, things that are quite difficult for even you to see in the water. Believe me, the muskies are super keen. They seem to be a little bit more productive in really pressured waters, or at least that's my experience. But when fish are unpressured and they're active, the brighter, the more bold that the bait is, it just makes the zone of awareness for the fish that much greater, and they're more likely to key in on it, and you're going to just increase the odds that the fish sees, feels your presentation. So I fish a lot of bright color baits, and orange is one of those colors too that I've just had tremendous success with on rivers. Maybe you've had different luck, but red horse have those kind of bright orange red tails. And I'm really positive that orange pattern in the bait can just be absolutely stunning. So summertime, you can't go anywhere without a bucktail. And the other baits that I really like to have in the boat are for summertime fishing is, of course, topwater. There's a number of different topwater style baits. But the prop bait has to be number one, just like the bucktail, because it's just so efficient. You can make a lot of casts. It comes in easy, doesn't follow often. And, these Lake X baits are a couple of my favorite ones that I like to throw. And this was a new one I got last year. If anybody fishes river muskies, you know that you catch a ton of big smallmouth bass when you're musky fishing. And when you're smallmouth fishing, you catch a ton of nice muskies. So a lot of times, some of these smaller baits, if you're going out and you're like, I'd love to catch a muskie, but I'd be really happy just to get some fish in the boat today, try throwing a few of these smaller. This is the smallest one that Lake X makes. It's just a little prop bait like that. Smallmouth crush it. You can still get a 30-pound muskie to come up and eat this bait. And these are really, really great baits for covering water. And if the fish are biting on top, it's awesome. Another one that I've done so well, like incredibly well with in river situations, is a jump bait, a walk the dog style bait is really, really dynamite, especially if the fish are really tucked into cover. So picture a big log jam in the river, and you're like, gosh, there's got to be a fish in there. Well, if you throw a bucktail in there and you burn it over that log jam, there's a good chance that the fish may have felt it, but doesn't really see it and get an opportunity to bite it. So a walk the dog style bait is something that you can just make sit in place. Doop, bloop, 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 back and forth. So it's sitting in that fish's strike zone. The fish knows it's there. They can get out of the cover. They can track it down. They can find it and they can hit it. You have to fish a little bit slower with this bait. But when you've got confidence that there are fish in an area, a walk the dog style bait, it doesn't have to be topwater. Topwater is often good. Or a glide bait that can just sit in front of that area for a long time to call the fish out of the heavier cover is really a dynamite technique. There's a couple rivers that I fish in northern Minnesota, and some of my best days in the summertime have been on this little bait. It just seems like, that doesn't even seem like a musky bait. This is a little Rapala X-Walk. It's the X-Rap Walk. It's, I think, the size 14, and that orange color, I've got tons and tons and tons of muskies on this bait. They absolutely love it. The great thing is you don't need to have a huge rod and reel to throw this setup. You can do it really easy. And I'm going to digress a little bit as we're talking about baits, because I was talking about the rod and reel that you're using. So the trend in musky fishing has been longer and longer rods, and longer rods are extremely valuable for a lot of certain situations in musky fishing, but often in rivers, a longer rod is not doing you any favors. So the longer the rod, really the less accuracy that you're going to have with that stick. So shorter rods help you become a much better target fisherman. So one of the sticks that I absolutely have to have in the boat when I'm musky fishing is one of the downsizers here. This is the Twitch stick. It's a 7'10". So the length is quite a bit shorter than what a lot of guys are fishing with, the 8'6", 9 foot. And people are even fishing 10-foot rods a lot now. But when you're trying to throw a small bait with a 10-foot rod in really close quarters, it's difficult. It really is. But when you've got a shorter stick, you can be really accurate in how you get those baits placed in those spots. And the other thing I'm fishing, especially with jerk baits, a lot of times in rivers, is I like having double paddles on my bait, or on my reel, excuse me. So that way when you're twitching the bait, it's not one single handle that you're trying to come in contact with. You've got the double paddle, so you're always able to keep contact with the reel. And if one happens to bite you or catch you off guard, you're not scrambling. It's like your hand can always find good purchase on the reel, and you can hook up with them. So 300 size reel, this downsizer musky stick. The downsizer, I feel like, has not gotten a lot of attention, and it's one of my favorite sticks for musky fishing. We've got a 9-footer, an 8'6", and then we've got this 7'10". And muskies, really, these rods can handle the biggest muskie out there, but musky rods are really designed for the lures that you're throwing, not so much the fight of the fish. So some of these baits I'm talking about, they're not very big, and you don't necessarily need to have a super heavy, super long rod. You can use stuff that's lighter. It's a lot more fun to catch the fish. It's a lot less fatiguing, and there's so many benefits to it. And the other thing that I fish with on a lot of these baits too is you'll see these smaller baits. Leader is really important. So a lot of people that are new to musky fishing, even if you musky fish a lot, it's just, okay, I'm going to go to the store. I'm going to buy a 130-pound fluorocarbon leader. It's got a huge ball bearing swivel on one end of it, and it's got a big snap on the other end of it. Well, it'd just be like trying to throw a number 5 shad wrap on a bait caster with 20-pound fluorocarbon. It's just not set up for that. So I fish a number of different styles of leader. For this little jerk bait that I'm talking about, for a lot of topwaters, I just run a single strand, 124-pound wire. If you've got a round nose pliers, you can learn to bend these wires extremely cheap, and it's just a short shank. That's all you need. The longer your leader, the more difficult it is to make both side maneuvers, and the shorter the leader is, the more you can control the bait at the boat. And if you overpower something like this little jump bait with a really heavy swivel on one end, you have to picture that this swivel is going like this. It's sinking down in the water, and so is the fluorocarbon. So the bait wants to dive down and not work on the surface. So just a really light wire leader like that will help keep this bait more balanced, and it's going to fish a lot better than it would. So I avoid putting swivels on baits or on leaders that I'm going to be fishing that are like jerk bait style. But if you're fishing a bucktail, you absolutely have to have a ball bearing swivel on the end. And see if I don't knock this over. This is how I set up my leaders too when it comes to the leader. I'm putting the swivel next to the snap. Now that might seem kind of odd that most of the leaders you see have the swivel up top rather than next to the clip or the split ring that you're using. When you do this, you can watch that leader start to wag and wobble. It puts way more vibration in your bucktails. I'm telling you, throw a bucktail on a leader that has a swivel tied to the main line, and throw one that has a swivel tied to the right next to the bait, and you're going to see a huge difference in how the baits perform. All right, we've got a little bit more time here. So sorry for that digression on the equipment, but it really is important to have the right equipment in river situations here. So what we were talking about, that jump bait on the surface, another great one is just something like this. This is just another glide style bait. So when those fish are in cover, like I was saying, it's really important to have a tool that you can get to just jump and walk in place, and is not covering a lot of distance, but staying near the target and where the fish would likely be. So walk the dog style baits, both surface and subsurface, are of course great tools for summertime musky fishing. Now as we get into the fall here, the bait selection tends to change, and it's changing because of the location of the fish often. So as the water cools, the fish tend to move to deeper, more moderate flows within the river. So other baits come into play. And we just had a river fishing legend walk in here, James Lindner. And so I'm going to tell a story about a situation James and I were in the fall, and a bait that both of us have in the boat all the time for fall fishing, and that's crankbaits. There's a number of styles of crankbaits, but listen to this one. This is the Storm Giant Flat Stick. And in the fall, you can get a lot of rain like you do in the spring, and you can get the water can become very turbid. This has been an absolutely amazing tool for fishing some of those deeper sections of river, and the fish know it's there. Listen to that thing. Oftentimes, it's just a simple cast it out, wind it back, and this bait is just chugging along, making contact with cover here and there, but it's getting low in the water, and the fish know that the bait is there. We had a situation, color was a big deal. I was talking about orange being a color. We had a situation a number of years ago. We were filming on a small river, and we were throwing these baits. I think Jimmy hooked 9 muskies that day or something crazy like that. And I did not get a bite until he let me have the color that he was using. Finally, after so many, I got a bite on a different color. But we threw everything in the tackle box, and it became so clear that you had to have a crankbait that got to the right depth and made a lot of noise and was a slow, steady retrieve. It wasn't a rip, 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 rip. When the water's cold and dirty, that slow and steady is often what it really is. And now when the water is clearer in the fall, there's a couple other baits that really come into play, and soft plastics are absolutely one of them. A Medusa, a tube, a bulldog. This is one of the baits that I love throwing in rivers. I can't tell you how many muskies I've caught in this. It's small again. It's a small bait, but I've caught 30 pounders. They'll just swallow this thing. They love these baits that have that vertical fall. So baits that are moving up and down vertically. Sometimes they're in that pattern where they want a crankbait that's going like this. Other times the fish want things that are moving vertically up and down. And having soft plastics in the boat is a great combo to have somebody working a crankbait and another person working a soft plastic. And that's often going to tell you what the mood of the fish can be, because fishing can often just be as simple as figuring out a pattern. It's just the direction, the plane in which the bait is moving, whether it's moving horizontal or vertical. So that can be a big deal in what's happening. And then the last thing I'll chat about before, as we talk about fall fishing, is live bait. And we're here in Wisconsin, and I know that live bait fishing for muskies is really, really a popular thing here. And river muskies are absolutely dumb when it comes to sucker fishing in the fall. And like I mentioned earlier, when you find those areas that hold wintering fish, and you've got confidence, you may have fished there a number of times over the years, you know there's fish there, and they're not responding to any of the traditional casting presentations that you've seen. You bust out the live suckers, and oh man, they can't resist themselves. It's a really, really, really cool pattern. So you have to be careful with this. When you find those areas, they're special. They last forever. Once you find those spots, they're good for the rest of your life. So don't burn the fish. Don't be, obviously you can't harvest many muskies, but they're very vulnerable. It's one of those situations in the fall where fish can be very vulnerable because you've got all of this river, all of this habitat, and all the fish in a certain section end up in very small areas. So with that, I think I'm gonna sign out on the River Musky deal. St. Croix Customer Appreciation Day is red hot out there. There's tons of fishing talk to be had out there. There's more great seminars coming up here. So thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you St. Croix for such a great event.